Life has a way of throwing up surprises when you least expect them. One minute you're mindlessly going about your business, another Saturday another to-do list, and the next your world has changed. That was the case for me the day I walked into my sister Dana's art studio. Dana had asked me to help set up her upcoming gallery show, and I'd agreed out of a sense of duty rather than enthusiasm. But that day the usual energy was missing. It seemed muted. Dana herself was out running errands, leaving her son Miles to hold down the fort. 19 and still teetering on the edge of adulthood, Miles had always struck me as reserved, polite but distant, the kind of kid who hangs in the background at family gatherings. I'd never thought much of him beyond our superficial interactions. That all changed the moment I found him in the back room. The door was slightly ajar, and I was just about to grab the box of canvases. Instead, I froze in the doorway, my eyes catching him hunched over his sketchbook, his hand on his leg, looking unacceptably cheesy and casual. Like I shouldn't be seeing it. Page after page of the same girl's drawings, her features vivid and strong, every pose suffused with a vitality that made her real. I must have made a sound, a shuffling, a creaking, because Miles's head snapped up. His face was pale, and he clutched the sketchbook to his chest as if it held his deepest secrets. "Aunt Lauren, what are you doing here?" His voice wavered slightly, the bravado in his words drowned out by panic. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to intrude," I mumbled, holding up my hands in surrender. I didn't know you were here." "You shouldn't have seen that," he blurted, shoving the album behind him. His cheeks were flushed, his posture awkward, as if he'd been caught in a lie. "Miles, it's okay," I said softly, taking a step back. "They're not what I expected." I hesitated, searching for the right words. "They're incredible." His eyes narrowed slightly, suspicion warring with something softer. "You don't have to say that." "I'm serious," I insisted. "Whoever she is, she's important to you, isn't she?" His expression faltered, and for a moment the composed exterior slipped. "It doesn't matter," he muttered as he passed me. "Just forget you saw anything." I didn't press him. I wanted to. Something about those sketches had stayed with me, but I let them go, sensing that pushing too hard would only make him retreat further. Still, something had changed in that brief, unexpected encounter. Over the next few days, I noticed it in the way Miles lingered longer when we were working together, or gave small, hesitant smiles that felt like olive branches. The days leading up to Dana's presentation were a blur of motion. The studio had become a hive of preparation, with every spare minute spent finalizing work, organizing logistics, and managing Dana's nervous enthusiasm. Miles and I found ourselves paired together more often, coordinating tasks with a quiet ease that hadn't existed before. The silence between us became less awkward, replaced by a subtle rhythm, passing tools back and forth, exchanging quick, almost conspiratorial glances whenever Dana's perfectionism degenerated into chaos. One evening, after I'd locked the door, Miles offered to walk me to the car, a simple gesture that shouldn't have meant anything, but somehow did. As we approached the car, he hesitated, standing close enough that I could feel his warmth despite the cool air. And then it happened. The kiss was sudden, hesitant and fleeting, so quick that it would have been easy to ignore if not for the way it lingered in the tense silence that followed. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. The world narrowed to that brief connection. When it was over, neither of us said a word. Miles stepped back, his expression a mixture of fear and determination, and I couldn't find the words. As I drove home, my thoughts raced, the memory of that kiss playing over and over in my head. It was reckless, confusing, and utterly impossible, but undeniable. Something had changed, something I couldn't quite put a name to, but knew would change everything. The days that followed were marked by a heavy silence between us. On the surface, everything seemed normal. Dana was immersed in the whirlwind of her gallery preparations, buzzing with excitement over every finalized piece and meticulously planned detail. Miles and I, however, had fallen into an uneasy rhythm of avoidance. He busied himself with tasks in the far corners of the studio, finding reasons to stay out of my way. When our paths did cross, he barely made eye contact, muttering short responses before retreating into his own world. At first, I told myself this was for the best. The kiss had been a mistake, a fleeting moment of confusion we could both ignore. But the memory lingered, weaving itself into my thoughts when I least expected it. I found myself hyper-aware of every interaction, no matter how small. The sound of his voice, the way he moved through the studio, the occasional glance he stole when he thought I wasn't looking. Then came the supply run. Dana had asked us to pick up materials from a nearby art store, and for the first time in days, we were forced to be alone together. The tension in the van was palpable as we drove, neither of us daring to break the silence. It was raining lightly when we arrived. I ran inside to gather the items on Dana's list while Miles stayed back to park the van. The store was bustling, filled with artists and students hunched over shopping carts piled with canvases and brushes. I wandered through the aisles, distracted, my thoughts too tangled to focus. I was reaching for a jar of turpentine on the top shelf when a familiar voice behind me said, "Let me get that." I turned to see Miles standing there, rain droplets clinging to his jacket and hair. He reached up, grabbing the jar effortlessly and handing it to me. "Thanks," I muttered, my voice catching slightly. He nodded but didn't walk away. Instead, he glanced at the list in my hand. "What else do you need?" "We're almost done," I said. "Just a few more things." We worked in silence after that, moving through the store with an efficiency that felt almost mechanical. But as we waited in line to pay, Miles finally broke the silence. "I've been trying to figure out how to talk to you," he said quietly, his gaze fixed on the floor. His words took me by surprise. I hesitated, unsure how to respond. And I still don't know," he admitted. The honesty in his voice caught me off guard. I wanted to press him, to ask what he meant, but the cashier called us forward before I could say anything. Back in the van, the conversation lingered in the air between us, unfinished and unresolved. The rain had picked up, drumming steadily against the roof as we drove back to the studio. Just as we pulled into the parking lot, Miles spoke again. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely audible over the rain. "For everything." I glanced at him, searching his face for some hint of what he was thinking. "Me too," I said softly. Neither of us elaborated. We sat there for a moment, the rain filling the silence, before stepping out of the van and returning to the carefully constructed chaos of Dana's studio. I had tried to stay invisible for most of the evening, content to let Dana shine. I helped when asked, cleaned up quietly, and stayed on the edges of conversations. But the weight of the night, the tension between Miles and me, the unspoken truths, followed me like a shadow. Miles had kept his distance too, moving between tasks with a quiet efficiency that betrayed no emotion. Yet, I felt his presence as if it were a physical pull, a gravity that kept drawing my eyes to him despite my best efforts to resist. As the last of the guests filtered out, the gallery grew quieter. Dana was busy with a small group, discussing logistics for transporting her work. I found myself wandering into a secluded part of the space, away from the noise, away from the scrutiny. I stared at one of her paintings, its swirling lines and vibrant colors blending together in a blur. My thoughts raced, a tangle of emotions I couldn't untangle. The sound of footsteps broke my reverie. I turned to see Miles approaching, his face unreadable, his movements hesitant. He stopped a few feet away, and for a moment, we simply looked at each other, the silence between us heavy with unspoken words. There was no plan, no conscious decision. It just happened. The space between us disappeared as though some invisible force had drawn us together. The kiss was soft at first, tentative like a question waiting for an answer. But then it deepened, carrying with it all the emotions we'd kept bottled up. Confusion, longing, guilt. For those few seconds, the rest of the world faded away. It was just us, suspended in a moment that felt both inevitable and impossible. But the spell shattered abruptly when I heard the sharp creak of a door opening. I broke away from Miles and turned toward the sound, my stomach dropping as I saw Dana standing in the doorway. Her face was a storm of emotions, confusion, disbelief, and then the unmistakable sting of betrayal. Her eyes darted between us, narrowing as realization dawned. "Dana," I began, my voice weak, trembling, but she raised a hand, cutting me off before I could say more. Her expression hardened, her jaw tight as she took a step back, shaking her head as if trying to erase the image before her. She didn't yell, didn't demand an explanation. Instead, she simply turned and walked away, the sound of her heels clicking on the gallery floor echoing in the silence she left behind. The air felt suffocating in her absence. I could feel my heart pounding, the enormity of what had just happened pressing down on me like a physical weight. Miles stood frozen beside me, his face pale, his eyes wide with shock. Neither of us spoke as the minutes dragged on, the silence between us growing heavier with each passing second. I wanted to say something, to explain, to apologize, but the words wouldn't come. What could I possibly say to make this right? Miles finally moved, stepping back, his expression unreadable. He didn't look at me as he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the gallery. I didn't follow. Alone in the quiet, I leaned against the wall, my legs shaky, my chest tight. The night had started as a celebration, a triumphant moment for Dana, but I had ruined it in the worst possible way. The look on her face when she saw us, hurt, betrayal, anger, was etched into my mind. The weight of my actions settled heavily on my shoulders. There was no undoing what had happened, no way to take it back. All I could do was stand there, staring at the empty doorway, knowing I had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The fallout was inevitable, and I had no one to blame but myself. The weight of Dana's words still echoed in my ears months later. "You're dead to me," she had screamed, her voice raw with fury and hurt. My own sister. The sound of shattering glass had punctuated her rage as she swept an entire shelf of paint jars to the floor. I had never seen her like that. My artistic, free-spirited sister transformed into someone I barely recognized. I fled to Millbrook, a sleepy town just far enough away to feel like escape but close enough to torture myself with the possibility of reconciliation. The local coffee shop became my office, the small apartment above the bookstore my sanctuary. I tried to build a new life from the fragments of the old one, telling myself that time would heal what I had broken. But Miles wouldn't let me forget. The first time I saw him in Millbrook, I thought I was imagining things, a ghost conjured by my guilty conscience. He was sitting on a bench in the town square, sketchbook in hand, just as I had found him that first day in the studio. When our eyes met, neither of us pretended it was coincidence. Days blurred into weeks and weeks into months. The seasons changed, painting Millbrook in different colors, but the weight of our choices remained constant. Miles had taken a room above the hardware store, a tiny space with slanted ceilings and a window that looked out over the town square. He worked at the local nursery, spending his days among the flowers and shrubs, his hands dirty with soil instead of charcoal. I watched from a distance as he carved out his own place in this town that was supposed to be my escape. The whispers followed us everywhere. Millbrook was too small for secrets, too conservative for scandals. Every sideways glance, every conversation that stopped when I entered a room, reminded me of what we had done. The older women at the grocery store would pull their carts to the other side of the aisle. The barista at the coffee shop would set my drink on the counter without meeting my eyes. I became a cautionary tale, the woman who destroyed her family for a boy barely out of his teens. Dana's rage had not cooled with time. She had systematically erased me from her life, removing every photo, every shared memory. Through mutual friends, I learned that she had taken down her website, canceled her social media accounts, anything to avoid seeing my name or face. The art studio where everything had begun was sold, the space transformed into a vintage clothing store. It was as if she was trying to erase not just me, but every trace of the life where I had existed. The guilt was a constant companion, wrapping around my chest like a vice. Some nights, I would wake gasping, the memory of Dana's face, contorted with betrayal and disgust, burning behind my eyelids. I threw myself into work, taking on freelance projects that kept me hunched over my laptop until the early hours of the morning. Anything to keep the thoughts at bay, to drown out the voice that whispered I deserved this exile. Yet Miles remained. He haunted the edges of my carefully constructed solitude, a persistent shadow that I couldn't or wouldn't shake. Each morning, he would be there in the town square, sketchbook in hand. His presence was both a comfort and a torment, a reminder of everything I had gained and lost. The magnetic pull between us hadn't diminished. If anything, it had grown stronger, fed by the guilt and isolation we shared. His own relationship with Dana had fractured beyond repair. She had thrown out his art supplies, donated his clothes, turned his bedroom into a home gym. The last time he had tried to visit, she had called the police. The restraining order arrived a week later, another piece of paper to document our destruction of everything that had once been whole. Winter settled over Millbrook like a shroud, bringing with it long nights and bitter winds. The holiday season approached, and with it came the sharp reminder of family gatherings I would no longer attend, traditions I had lost the right to share. The Christmas lights strung across Main Street seemed to mock the darkness we carried within us. Miles's presence in town had become as much a part of the landscape as the old courthouse or the Presbyterian church on the hill. He had grown quieter, more introspective, his teenage awkwardness giving way to something harder, more defined. The boy I had first kissed in the gallery parking lot was disappearing, replaced by someone shaped by the consequences of our choices. I watched this transformation from my self-imposed distance, feeling both responsible and powerless. The town's judgment had created an invisible barrier around us, a bubble of shared isolation that pushed us closer even as I tried to maintain space between us. Every accidental meeting, every shared glance across the street, carried the weight of everything we had destroyed and everything we couldn't let go. Spring returned to Millbrook, bringing with it the scent of new beginnings that felt like a cruel joke. I would pass by sometimes, watching him work among the roses and hydrangeas, his movements sure and purposeful. He looked more at home there than he ever had in Dana's studio, as if he had finally found his own space to grow. But growth comes at a cost, and ours had been devastating. The void where Dana should have been yawned wider with each passing day, a black hole that threatened to consume everything in its path. The love that had sparked in those stolen moments now felt like a curse, a punishment for daring to want something we shouldn't have. Yet here we remained, bound together by our shared exile, unable or unwilling to break free from the gravity of what we had become. The small-town gossip eventually faded to background noise, replaced by newer scandals and fresher tragedies. But the fundamental truth remained unchanged. We had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, broken something that could never be repaired. And in this quiet town, far from the life I had known, I carried the weight of that knowledge like a stone in my chest, even as Miles's constant presence reminded me that some choices, once made, become our destiny. Time has a way of softening even the sharpest edges. After a year in Millbrook, the whispers had faded to silence, and our careful dance of avoidance gave way to something else entirely. It happened on a rainy October evening, when the autumn wind rattled the windows of my apartment. Miles had stopped by to return a book, at least, that's what we told ourselves. But as he stood there, water dripping from his hair onto my worn wooden floors, something shifted in the air between us. His fingers brushed mine as he handed over the book, and the electricity that had always hummed between us sparked into life. The kiss was nothing like our first, no hesitation, no guilt, just the raw honesty of everything we'd been holding back. His hands tangled in my hair, the book forgotten at our feet, and for the first time since we'd fled to Millbrook, I felt truly alive. We built our life in shadows at first, like teenagers sneaking around. Miles kept his room above the hardware store, a hollow pretense that fooled no one in our small town. But the secrecy didn't last. It couldn't, not in a place where everyone knew everyone else's business. The first time Mrs. Peterson from the grocery store saw us holding hands in the park, her disapproving glare felt like absolution. We were done hiding. Our relationship wasn't a fairy tale ending to a forbidden romance. Miles's youth showed itself in bursts of impulsivity that clashed with my need for stability. We fought about money, his casual spending versus my careful budgeting. We argued about his dreams of traveling the world while I wanted to put down roots. One particularly heated argument ended with him storming out at midnight, only to return hours later, soaked from the rain, apologizing through chattering teeth. The night he accidentally broke my grandmother's antique vase, the ensuing silence was deafening. I said things I regretted, cruel words about his immaturity, his inability to care for anything valuable. He retaliated by bringing up Dana, the one topic we had tacitly agreed to avoid. We didn't speak for 3 days after that, the longest 72 hours of my life, until he showed up with a poorly repaired vase and tears in his eyes. But for every fight, there were moments of pure joy that made it all worthwhile. The Sunday morning he surprised me with an entire garden planted overnight, every flower chosen to match the colors in my favorite painting. The time we got caught in a summer storm and ended up dancing in the rain in the town square, scandalizing the church crowd but too happy to care. The quiet evenings when he would sketch while I worked, the scratch of his pencil a comforting counterpoint to my typing. News of Dana reached us in fragments. She had moved to the coast, opened a new gallery, started teaching at an art school. Her indifference, when we heard about it, was both a relief and a new kind of pain. But we were too busy navigating our own storms to dwell on hers. The Christmas Eve when our heating broke tested both our patience and our relationship. Huddled under every blanket we owned, we bickered about whose turn it was to call the repair service, only to end up laughing at the absurdity of it all. That night, sharing body heat and whispered dreams, we realized we had built something real, something that could withstand both external judgment and our own demons. Miles's art evolved, moving from portraits to landscapes, then to abstract pieces that captured emotions rather than images. The first time he threw an entire canvas across the room in frustration, I learned to give him space. When he spent 3 days barely speaking, lost in a creative funk, I discovered that sometimes love means simply being present in the silence. Our tiny apartment became a battleground and a sanctuary. We fought over dirty dishes left in the sink, over the constant mess of his art supplies, over my tendency to work late into the night. The neighbors probably knew our business better than they wanted to, but in Millbrook, that was just part of life. The night Miles got the call about a potential gallery showing in New York, our celebration turned into an argument about long-distance relationships and career priorities. It ended with broken plates and slammed doors, but also with a compromise that showed how far we'd come. He would pursue his art, but we would face the future together. We never married. It felt wrong somehow, too formal a declaration for what we had become. Instead, we built our life in small decisions and big arguments, in passionate reconciliations and comfortable silences. Each step forward was taken with the full knowledge that we were imperfect, that we would hurt each other, but that we would also heal together. Life settled into a rhythm punctuated by the occasional chaos we created. My work expanded, even though he sometimes resented the long hours it required. We learned to fight fair, to apologize sincerely, to love despite, or perhaps because of our differences. The town's judgment faded to background noise, replaced by the sound of our shared laughter, our heated debates, our whispered apologies. Our love, once a scandal, had become something both ordinary and extraordinary, a daily choice to face our demons together, to weather our storms side by side, to build something lasting from the ashes of what we'd burned. Years passed, and the scandal that had brought us to Millbrook became just another story, told less often and with less interest. We had become part of the landscape, our fights and reconciliations as much a part of local life as the changing seasons. Our love, once a source of whispered gossip, had weathered into something real and imperfect and enduring, like the wildflowers in Miles's garden that bloomed despite the frost, stronger for having survived the storms. Update 1. Hey Reddit! Some of you might remember my post from years ago about the gallery incident that turned my life upside down. I never expected to be back here writing an update, but something happened 2 months ago that I needed to share. I married him. It still feels surreal typing those words. After everything that happened, the scandal, moving to Millbrook, the years of whispers and judgment, Miles and I finally made it official. And the most incredible part? Dana was there. The ceremony wasn't anything fancy. We held it in Miles's garden, which has become something of a local attraction in our small town. Funny how life works out. It was a warm Saturday evening. Fairy lights strung through the trees he'd planted years ago, surrounded by the flowers he's poured his heart into growing. I almost didn't send Dana an invitation. After 5 years of silence, it felt like reopening an old wound. But Miles insisted, saying he'd regret it forever if we didn't at least try. So we sent it, expecting nothing in return. The response came 3 weeks later. A simple yes with a handwritten note. Life's too short to hold on to anger forever. Seeing her walk into the garden that day, I can't even describe the feeling. She looked different, older, like me, but softer somehow. The hard edges of betrayal had worn away. She hugged Miles first, then me, and whispered, "You both look happy." No drama, no tearful reconciliations, just quiet acceptance. The kiss at the ceremony, because I know some of you will ask, was perfect. Miles still had to bend down slightly. He's grown even taller over the years, and I could hear him laughing against my lips because I was shaking so much. Someone wolf whistled. Pretty sure it was one of the regulars from the bookstore. And just like that, 5 years of tension dissolved into joy. The best moment, though? During the reception, I found Dana and Miles sitting together in a quiet corner of the garden. She was looking through his latest sketchbook, not the forbidden portraits of years ago, but his new work. Her face had that familiar artistic focus I remembered so well, and she was pointing out techniques, giving suggestions. Just a mother and son talking about art, as if the years between had been nothing but a long intermission. She stayed in our guest room that night. We didn't talk about the past. There was an unspoken agreement to let those sleeping dogs lie. Instead, we talked about her new gallery, about Miles's upcoming exhibition, about the mundane details of our lives that we'd missed in each other's absence. It's been 2 months now. Dana calls every Sunday. Sometimes the conversations are still awkward, but they're getting easier. Miles is happier than I've ever seen him. The age gap that once seemed so scandalous is just another detail of our story now. I remembered about this post last night, while going through old emails. It felt important to come back, to close the circle, to tell you that sometimes, the things that break us open also let the light in. Life isn't perfect. We still have our fights. Ask anyone in Millbrook about the Great Garden House incident of last month, and there are still moments when the weight of our history catches up to us. But we're happy. Really, truly happy. That's it, Reddit. Thanks for listening, both then and now. And if anyone out there is in the middle of their own impossible situation, sometimes time really does heal all wounds. Even the ones we think will bleed forever. Edit. For those asking about our age gap, I'm 39 now, he's 24. Love isn't always convenient or conventional, but when it's real, it's worth fighting for.